Behold, my glorious supporter, isn't that right? Has requested some discussion about, I'm going to call it min-maxing styles. Isn't that right asks, how often do you think Buildcraft is about maximizing benefits and concentrating benefits into overlapping high roll spikes? Smita Charm buffs stacking in Warframe comes to mind. And how often about minimizing detriments, drawbacks, or maximizing what low rolls give you? This may be an interesting, confusing question for some people. It's an interesting question to me. So let me explain it a few different ways first. But I have a lot to say about this. There are a few different ways you could approach this question. I've got a lot to say. So what is this question? It's basically about the idea of building around the things that your thing is good at, or building to fix the things your thing is bad at, or other stuff in between. How people think about that, how often games are about that, etc. So I think the first thing to say as a starting point is that most games with good buildcraft that I've played, or you could say that I think have good buildcraft, but whatever, take it as a premise that both of these things are generally wrong. They're wrong by default, and there are styles you can take or ways you can use extra space. Let me talk about that more. So when I say they're wrong by default, what I mean is that from a mathematical perspective, maximizing your benefits is usually done by not maximizing anything. So for example, when you want damage in Warframe or in Genshin Impact or in any game, because of how just math works, you don't ever want to stack up one thing unless the other things are just objectively terrible. If you have crit and status in the game, you want both because they're multipliers. It doesn't often matter how much or little crit or status a weapon has, you just want both because they're multipliers. You wouldn't build a weapon for damage in Warframe with anything but base damage, multi-shot, crit, and status unless one of those things just arbitrarily didn't work. It's the exception rather than the rule that you would ever not do that, right? In Genshin Impact, even if a character has a stat that scales with all their stuff, you generally still want to mix your damaging stats because they exist and they're multipliers. If there's a stat in the game that increases your damage by 1%, and a stat in the game that increases your attack stat by 1%, and crit stats in the game, and you get about even amounts of them, which you do in Genshin Impact and most other sensible games, then you want all of them. And there isn't really a way that the game is going to be able to math you such that you would want to just stack up all of one of them, unless you were going for something very specific, of course. I have builds in Genshin Impact where my character is building the same stat on all three of their pieces where you choose a stat, but that's because that character doesn't do damage most of the time, or there just aren't multipliers, or you get them elsewhere, right? For example, I have healing characters that are using HP for their gear, and then their set bonus is healing percent, because that about evens out the HP and the heal. Or maybe HP healing percent, and then they have two sources of HP and kind of two sources of healing percent because they've got that one piece and then the set bonus. And it's evening it out in slots like that, picking those slots and evening out the number of slots you're using. That is the thing that generally leads to the most optimized, simple builds. And one of the premises of my channel going forward is that you don't really need to learn about individual games to have some idea how Buildcraft probably works. You can generally just follow that idea, and in most games that have meaningful Buildcraft, it will work. That will be a very good build, if not the best build. In many games, it is often the best. You don't have to do the math. It is the best. You can have no doubt. And in many games, there's, a small but significant number of cases where there are exceptions to, even if you just want damage, that's not necessarily the best way. Or, yes, that is the best way to get the most damage, but you don't always only want damage. For example, in Genshin Impact, you often want to consider your character's energy recharge. If you have a damaging support like Xingqiu or Chongyun, they might wish to have energy recharge percent for their bursts, not on Chongyun, but just as an example, Xingqiu, because that gives them uptime on their damage source. That is, in a way, a separate multiplier. And if they have a lot of attack, but they can't use their damaging ability, it doesn't matter. So you consider it that way, right? So that's all very interesting and kind of the premise of this discussion. So, reading the question again, how often do you think Buildcraft is about maximizing benefits and concentrating benefits into overlapping high roll spikes? How often about minimizing detriments, drawbacks, or maximizing what low rolls give you? The answer, mostly objectively, is not very often. Generally, the best way to get any benefit out of anything in any game is usually to do neither of those things, I would say. That being said, I think the exceptions are very interesting. Now, briefly, you may consider maximizing benefits to be that multiplier balancing I just talked about, right? You could consider that doing that thing. And in Warframe, for example, there are times when you have a weapon that has, you can make that kind of build, but the weapon has maybe like a really bad magazine size and then a really bad reload speed. In Warframe specifically, I don't think I've ever encountered a weapon where the damage that the weapon can provide is so high, but those stats are so low that it justifies building for to alleviate the crit, the reload speed and not the crit rate, the reload speed and the magazine size. So in other words, imagine a weapon where or in any game where, yes, you have enough space, just barely enough space to build for all the multipliers, but there's some other quality of life or usability aspect of the weapon that is so bad that you want to build to rebuff that instead, to like fix that, to make it more usable, the reload speed, the magazine size, whatever, energy recharge. And the thing that you're building does so much damage that it's worth not building damage and you still get more damage. You see what I'm trying to say? Really, for that to be the case, you need to have multiple things you can do. So maximizing low rolls, this whole high rolls and low rolls thing, by the way, if that confuses you, just think of it as the ceiling, the things that the thing is good at, or the benefits, or the ceiling, the payoff. And then the low rolls are like the things that it's not so good at, or its weak points, or whatever. So maximizing low rolls might be considered rounding something out, and maximizing high rolls might be considered, again, sort of maximizing the thing's strength. What's interesting to mention here, I think, is this idea that a lot of players, broadly speaking, fall into a basic mindset where they just do one or the other by default, which is generally just incorrect mathematically, but it's interesting to know, and I think a lot of game developers keep this in mind because you can see it in games. This idea that, oh, this weapon has a lot of crit, so I'll build a lot of crit. That's just not how math works. The fact that it has a lot of crit doesn't mean you want to only build that. It's still mathematically more sound to build an even spread of things. And I think for some people, that's hard to accept until you just do the math, like until you see the math. I don't particularly think it's valuable to do the math for every single situation, but I do think it's very helpful as an exercise to think about the old, on my stream, we were talking about a really good example that somebody was saying, I do it with, 100 times 100 or versus plus 100, or 100 times 2 versus 100 plus 100, and then if you change the amounts. But this is a way better example. You have two multipliers, and you can invest up to 5 points into each one, and they multiply each other. So 5 times 5 is 25. If you do 4 times 6, that is, you don't build the multipliers evenly, you only get 24, and it only gets worse from there. If you do 3 times 7, that would be fairly heavily investing in one of the multipliers, like crit, over another, like status. Then all things being equal, which they aren't always, but you're getting only 21. So you can see very clearly, using that mathematic example, 5 times 5 is a good one, that it's just suboptimal not to evenly balance the multipliers. And what you'll find, I think, is that in many games, they are pretty evenly balanced. Or even if they aren't, because you have, in Warframe, a certain number of slots, you can just take a slot of crit damage, a slot of elemental damage, a slot of status, kind of both with the dual stat mods. And that about evens it out, right? So the idea of sort of building into a high roll spike or increasing the ceiling is usually not very viable. But now we'll get to the part of the discussion where I think things get pretty interesting, which is where there are exceptions. So in Warframe, Smedekavats have their charm loot buff that gives you double loot and affinity and such for a little while, and they can stack, but they multiply. They're not additive. They multiply each other. It's the same thing, but they multiply each other. That's unusual. Most games, that doesn't work that way. If you get the same thing, it adds to the thing. Why would it multiply? But this one does. It doubles. It's not like plus 100%. It just doubles, I guess. And so if you get 2 Smeda Charm buffs for loot, you get 4 times the amount of loot, not just 3. If you get 3, you get 8 times, not 4. Cool. That's nice, but that's an exception. You can see how that's an exception. And of course, there are weapons like that have smaller exceptions where it's not that they multiply some benefit. There could be the reverse thing where something that you'd think would be additive is multiplicative, but then there's another thing, which is there are not as many multiplicative things. So it's not that additive becomes any better. It's just it wins by default. There is nothing else to put on. So for example, on some weapons in Warframe do damage in a way, probably not the only way, but in a way that is not affected by multi-shot. And so you end up putting on more status or crit or base damage or whatever, but not because it's any more mathematically sound, just because there is nothing else to put on the weapon. And generally those weapons are not so great, but sometimes they have enough stats that it's fine. Because Warframe has enough different multipliers working together, sometimes you can get there. If you lose one, that can be acceptable. So that's interesting. But where I think this discussion really gets fascinating, and you can really see people's build crafty styles, is not so much in the whole, does the person not understand math and think that it's better to build stack a ton of one stat, right? Because that's like, it's interesting. I'm not trying to, and it's fine if you do that, don't feel bad, but it's just wrong. And so from a mathematical or a game design perspective, it's not that interesting to discuss to me, because it's just a misunderstanding. If games explain themselves better and helped people understand, people largely wouldn't do that, I think. No, what I think gets interesting is where you look at thinking of it as, rather than high roll spikes, thinking of it as, do I want to have this thing be as good as it can possibly be when it's good, or do I want it to be good more often? So let me give you an example. Genshin Impact is a really good source of examples, but in Warframe too, you have weapons that will do really good damage. Let's start with Warframe actually, but they self-stagger. So maybe you have a really powerful explosive, but it just self-staggers you like nobody's business. The explosion hits you and then you get stunned and meh. You could look at that and say, okay, I'm willing to sacrifice a little bit of damage to make it not stagger me. Although cautious shot doesn't make you lose that much damage. But anyway, let's just say you could do that. And what you're doing there is saying this weapon does enough damage in a powerful enough way that I'm willing, like we talked about before, to sacrifice some of that damage to make it more usable. Or the other side of that is this does so much damage when it's good that I'm willing to play around when it's, or the way in which it's bad. And instead I'll build it just to use it when it's at its most powerful. Now, a lot of games like Warframe and Genshin Impact, they have enough different options that you say to you, I think you would consider saying to yourself, well, I don't have to use this all the time. So doesn't it make more sense to maximize, right? If you have a lot of options, just only use it when its detriment is covered for, right? So with an explosive weapon, why not simply only use the weapon when you are negating stagger? There are lots of ways to negate stagger. You might not always be negating stagger, but do you always want to use that weapon every single mission, every single time? I don't know. It, to me, makes sense to say, okay, but I'll just wait until I am negating staggers, and then the bonus I get from that, because negating a self-stagger doesn't do anything if you're not self-staggering. It's the opportunity to get a bonus, and that bonus is more damage, basically. You get to cash in that benefit. You kind of have enablers and then payout sources of a payout. And there are two different ways to think of it if you view it that way. You can either build something to get rid of the enabler, or to maximize the payout when you have the enabler. And I often think that in games like Warframe, Genshin Impact, we'll get to Hades in a second too, as an interesting example. it makes the most sense to me anyway to maximize the payout. But a lot of people don't think this way. They don't like the idea that the thing is interdependent on something else. And I get that too. I feel like sometimes you go too far and the thing is practically useless without the enabler, and then it doesn't feel so good. You have well, let's not get into that in Genshin Impact, but I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Thundering Fury memes we've been on about. And in Warframe, there are a lot of cases where, you know, if a weapon just feels bad on most Warframes, unless they're enabling it, okay, I get why you wouldn't like that, sure. Even so, I really do feel like a lot of the time, it doesn't make sense in a game with many different tools at your disposal to build something to not have an enabler when you have a whole loadout, 4 characters or a Warframe and 3 weapons, 4 weapons, which gives you many opportunities to enable a thing. That doesn't make sense. What are you doing with the other slots? They're not doing anything, you know? But I get that people want things to be flexible and don't want to have to finally craft a loadout every time they play. I get that. So the sort of other way to think of this idea of, do you remove the enabler or do you maximize the payout, is in Hades. Hades does this interesting thing relative to this discussion where you often can't maximize benefits. There's just nothing you can do. You can't take your attack that's already doing something and make it do even more damage a lot of the time. Sometimes you can, there are usually a few ways. But generally in Hades, you get 1 boon for your attack, 1 boon for your special, 1 boon for your cast. And you might be able to get some add-on effects, but they generally only indirectly increase damage. Or they increase damage, but not the damage of that thing. They make you do damage some other way. And so in Hades, you're often thinking about, okay, well, I'm not always attacking, right? I'm not always doing my special, or maybe I am, in which case I don't care about these other things. But if I'm not going to always be casting, then don't I value some other thing that would be powerful? And it's okay if it doesn't multiply. It's more like filling out your rotation. Get like checking. What's similar to the other buildcraft is that it has that feeling of checking the boxes of, you know, in a Warframe build, you get your base damage and your multi-shot and your crit and your status and your elemental and your crit damage. You know, you're going through the multipliers and getting each one of them secured. Whereas in Hades and games like it, you're often in a situation where you have an amount of time, and as a premise for the build, you're going to cast, but you can only cast like every 3 seconds or something. So, you know, in that time, I want to fill that time with blocks where I'm doing a good thing that gives me value, damage, or it protects me somehow or something, right? And then once it's full, suddenly it's less valuable to get more of those things. The same way that in a normal build with multipliers, once you have them, getting another multiplier, having even more space is actually, it's not bad, but it's a lot less good in a way that might not seem obvious. Getting a 9th mod slot in Warframe would often do very little for a lot of it. There were weapons that would do something because you'd get to run some utility-ish 9th mod. But a lot of the time, it wouldn't do much because you already have all the multipliers. So any mod you add is not multiplying everything, it's just adding, and that just has relatively minimal impact. And the same thing in Hades. Once you're doing something all the time, you can get an option to do something else, but you can there's an opportunity cost, which I guess is a little different than the multiplier thing. But the point is, you've kind of used up your opportunity points, which I think creates this interesting back and forth when making builds that way. So yeah, I don't know. I find this topic very interesting. I think it's helpful to keep in mind that people think of it different ways. I think when people talk about there being a best in slot item or whatever in these games that have good buildcraft where there clearly is no best thing, they're just different, it's easy to understand what's happening. To them, the thing they're talking about that has some best option is only good for one thing, or that's the only thing that they care about, and they're either not acknowledging or they're too lazy to acknowledge their bias that it's that thing. They're oversimplifying, but they don't care to clarify, and something like that. Who knows? And it's helpful to understand that when thinking about the way that people talk about these games, because it helps you understand that they maybe do understand how the buildcrafty stuff works. It's not that they do think that there is only one good thing, but it's not that they don't understand math or something, you know, it's that they only care about maybe one sort of benefit. And I think that the trick comes when people like me often get interpreted as being kind of cute or we're trying to pretend that there are build crafty options when there aren't, because it would be more fun if there were, we think. But actually we're doing there's this sort of mentality of eat your vegetables game design. You're not really supposed to do that though. You're really just supposed to do this because it's just the best thing. That's not actually true, and in fact it feels to me like those people are pretending there's only one best option because then it would be simpler or something, which is fine. I think it's good that there can be a simple option, but a lot of the time what clears up the confusion is this understanding that if you think about maximizing a benefit versus minimizing a detriment or evening out some stats, it helps you understand why people would think a certain way about a thing and helps you communicate on the terms of making a kind of build that people are actually looking for, making the type of build that the other person in the conversation is actually talking about making, which can make it easier to do. In fact, after answering this parlay, I have realized that I should really go out of my way to clarify and maybe even play up the differences between those when I make builds in Framework, for example. It might be helpful to hear, this is a build where this Warframe has a sort of rounded kit, so I'm focusing on playing to that strength. Or they have a rounded kit, but they can focus a lot on this, so you could do that, and thinking of it that way. Or this Warframe is really good at this one thing, but I want them to be good at more things. Or this Warframe is not good at a lot of stuff, but good at this thing, so I want to make them good at something else too. Stuff like that. Those are all valid ways to think of it. It's just a matter of understanding that goal and committing to it in some way, figuring out where the value will be. Particularly at the end, I have a good example about Genshin Impact that comes up really often for me, which is this idea of these characters that need a lot of energy to use their burst, but then it does a lot of damage. Do you give them the ability to get their burst more often, or do you give them more damage during their burst? More damage is more valuable than usual because their burst is so powerful, but giving them their burst is more valuable than usual too, because without it, they don't do the thing, right? To me, generally, the answer is to make them more powerful during their burst, because if you, the enabling, going back to that enabling thing from before, enabling them to have their burst, that's a replaceable thing. You can have another character do that, but making them do more damage during their burst, it's generally not as replaceable. You can have another character generate particles, and you can still make them do more damage. It's not like you can't have damage buffing characters on the team while doing that. But generally giving them a weapon that does more damage, rather than giving them a weapon that recharges their energy or something, generally the going for the payoff is valuable. And so it's interesting to me how, despite how kind of wrong this feeling about building into a high roll spike, like as you said in the question, despite how wrong that can be, this weapon is good at crit, so I'll build a bunch of crit. That's pretty much just wrong mathematically. Conversely, it can make a lot of sense when you have a character that has some standout benefit. It is then worth enabling them in some other way. But ultimately, that creates a lot of the character of different games. It depends how many resources the games gives you to enable it. In Genshin Impact, for example, you practically always have the ability to put a character in your team that will give you some outside benefit and also battery for a character that needs their burst. So the idea of, but I need to make sure this character gets their ability, gets enough energy, that's just not as necessary, because Genshin Impact is designed in a way where you very rarely do not have the ability to add that somewhere else. Whereas Warframe is not dissimilar. You have a lot of space in your loadout, but it is less omnipresent that you can just immediately enable anything you want. That's not as true as it is in Genshin Impact, where I have basically never encountered a team where if you build a character to their strengths rather than to shore up their weaknesses, then somehow you have a problem. That has not happened to me yet in my time playing. I've played all of Genshin Impact for the whole time it's been out, and that has not yet happened. So I don't know. The game is just designed that way to some degree. It doesn't mean it's wrong to build the character to enable themselves and be self-sufficient. That could be useful. But just to say you always can get away with building this other way without much of a sacrifice. Whereas in Warframe, it depends. It does. There are a lot of ways to negate staggers for explosive weapons, but there's a countable number. You don't always have one. You could always have one with the helmet system, but anyway, I don't know. I think that's interesting. And then Hades, of course, sometimes you need this enabling effect, and it's pretty hard. You spend a lot of the run chasing that effect. So I think that creates a lot of the interesting texture in those games. So yeah, I don't know. There's a lot to say about this topic, but I think it's pretty interesting. It's fun to discuss the idea of which effects are worth kind of sacrificing stuff for. And I think when Buildcraft really gets fun to me, and when I see people get excited about Buildcraft, it's when they're deciding that stuff. It's not necessarily that they want a simple answer or not. I think some people that want a simple answer get excited about that too. It's not necessarily when you're embracing the big damage or the enabling or whatever. It's just making the breakthrough to understand that that is a choice that you can choose to make. And if the game is designed well, neither of the choices are wrong. You're just, which way do you want it? What do you want? And then if you don't care, then you could just pick whichever one you want, and it's fine. Generally, one of them is default. You build a certain way, and that is the high roll one or the low roll one, the maximizing the benefits or minimizing the detriments. One of them is kind of default, and then you choose which, if you want to change it. So I don't know. Personally, I think it's really interesting, but I know some people find this an irksome topic because they think it overcomplicates what they want as their relaxing fun. And I hope that over the course of my time making videos, I can help those people feel differently if it's possible, or at least give them a simple answer that still works for everybody else if I can't.